I've got friends that love to criticize the Obama administration, and I can talk about mistakes the Obama administration made too, and in particular in the area of immigration. But there has not been this intentional sowing of hatred and encouraging people to focus on the differences among people as opposed to the commonality among people. That is not something I have ever seen before.
At what point does encouragement cross the line and not become protected speech and no longer qualify as protected speech?
Well, there's very specific law. It's got to be an immediate threat of serious physical harm, and then you've got a situation in which speech can be, if not prohibited, at least criminalized. But to see this kind of speech come out of the mouth of the President of the United States, even if it isn't close enough to constitute specific incitement to violence, it's certainly reprehensible, and I think something for all of us to be ashamed of when our elected representatives act that way.
The polarization is just very powerful, I think, and you were talking about fear and how that's a main theme in a lot of what he says and does, and I think that goes towards creating that polarization, because if you can divide people, then you can conquer them, and I think fear plays a lot into his rhetoric as well, and that rhetoric is, as we've seen, very powerful. And I'm constantly reminded in a lot of the things that he says and does of Animal Farm,
right.
Great Brook, Squealer, the pig in Animal Farm, and how he used to basically make a lot of these same speeches and use a lot of these propaganda techniques in order to convey his message to the other animals. I think that's very reminiscent of what we see now in terms of, obviously, immigration and even the issues with Colin Kaepernick, that this idea that if you're going against kind of what he thinks or his agenda or the administration's agenda, that you're polarizing yourself and going into being unpatriotic as well. That sort of talk about having a duty to your country. Well, where's the line between nationalism and going more towards like xenophobia? It's like you said, it's a very, very troubling thing, problematic.
I mean, I look around this room and, I look real different from all of you guys, to my detriment, I might add. But I can focus on that, or you can focus on that, or you can focus on the things that bring us together and the things that we have in common, which vastly outweigh the things that divide us. And we know that in human beings there's a certain amount of tribalism, a certain amount of favoritism, call it implicit bias or whatever. We tend to connect more easily with people who are like us in different ways, including people who look like us. Why you would want to have a government policy that encourages acting on those divisions instead of trying to focus on our commonality is, I won't say it's a mystery to me, because it's not much of a mystery. I mean, this is standard propaganda techniques. It can be very incendiary to compare this administration to various forms of totalitarianism and the various labels that come along with that. But if you read a little history and you read how autocrats come into power, it is hard to avoid seeing echoes of that, if not outright copying, in what we're seeing in this country today.
A lot of similarities.
Funny thing is, he's just less charismatic. I mean, you look
He's
at
not really your kind of guy.
Yeah, you look at Chavez. I mean, like, at least he could give a speech.
Yeah. I think that it is astonishing, and a lot of people on the progressive side have never yet figured out what his attraction is to so much of his base. It's hard to know what that is. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not going to speculate on that. All I know is that when you've got the kind of policies that we're seeing and the kind of heavy-handed law enforcement that we're seeing in this country, it fits into a pattern.
You touched on speculation. I kind of want to get you to speculate on a couple of the issues that are coming up here recently. So Trump has kind of consistently disparaged his attorney general. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it before. Do you think Trump is eventually going to just fire Sessions? And what do you think the consequences are going to be? And what do you think that'll have on the impact of the Mueller investigation?
Well, first of all, we always tell witnesses not to speculate. But in this case,
Right.
It's still hard to speculate. I will say that the minute anybody says, "Oh, he would never do X," you pick up. Remember the newspaper on the front porch in the morning, the thing you don't know anything about. But
Is it like an email?
it's like that. It's a lot like that. It's damper after it rains, though. So, I'm willing to speculate, but I'm totally incapable of speculating. Rod Rosenstein was going to quit, and then he was going to get fired, and then he was going to quit, and then he was going to get fired. I do suspect that people are trying to get this president not to rock the boat too badly before the midterm elections, and I do think there's a substantial movement to try to keep things a little less chaotic, so that those elections aren't sort of turned upside down from the president's point of view. But in terms of what he's going to do, I think he has exhibited his lack of respect for law enforcement. I think he's exhibited his lack of respect for lawyers and for the Department of Justice. And I think he will do anything he can to try to save himself from threats to his authority.
Right. What I really found astonishing, because he talked about, the policing and authority, is that the Republican Party seemed like it was very pro FBI, and you don't disparage the FBI. That's part of the United States of America. And what's hard for me to fathom is how quickly it turned from the FBI is this great organization to the FBI. Everybody should go. It's all corrupt and everything is horrible with it. And you just saw in polls, Republican respect for the FBI at like 70-80%, and now it's down to 20-30%. I don't know how. It seems to be that kind of that authoritarian measure where they're able to change people's minds so quickly.
Yeah, this is probably as good a time as any for me to point out that the views expressed on this program are not necessarily the official views of the American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota, much less the American Civil Liberties Union. But I do think that it is important from the point of view of each of us to be living in a civilized society where you've got predictability in terms of what the rules are that we're operating under, and I think that the chaos that we're seeing is harmful, especially to vulnerable populations, people of color, immigrants, who literally find the rules changed on them from one day to the next. It's what we saw when the Muslim ban was implemented. The rules got changed when people were literally up in the air in the sense of being in airplanes. And by the time they landed in this country, the rule had changed. It's one thing to have the rules change when you've got lots of lawyers and plenty of money and a nice place to live. It's a very different thing when you're more vulnerable and less able to protect yourself from unlawful and illegitimate government power.
And speaking of immigrants, so currently there are more than 200 migrant children still separated from their parents that are in U.S. custody. How do you see this actually ending and these families actually getting reunited?
When you think about things that you would never imagine your government to be doing, tearing children out of the arms of their fathers and mothers ought to be pretty high on the list. But of course, that's exactly what we saw. When that started to happen and became the intentional government policy, the ACLU started a lawsuit in California, as a result of which more than 2,000 children have been reunited with their parents. There has been enormous progress. There was a joint report to the court this week in which the court expressed some, shall we say, disappointment in the Justice Department's position, but did indicate that in his view there was a substantial progress being made toward reuniting all of these children with their families to the extent it can be done. Some of these parents they literally cannot find. Some of them may be incarcerated and they can't be reunited. I don't really know, but if the number of 200 or so is right, still in a separated situation, I will tell you that the ACLU is not going to quit until those last 200 are reunited with their families, because one of the things that we've tried to demonstrate, and I think have demonstrated over the years, is that we don't back down. We don't quit until the battle's been won, and the battle's not going to be won until every one of those kids is reunited.
And so, what do you say to the Trump administration when they said, well, the ACLU, with all of your resources that you have, maybe you guys should be the ones to, reunite these children? What would your response be to the administration? I think to call that presumptuous would not be an overstatement. The fact that they would engage in this policy and then imply that the ACLU has got the resources to fix the problem that the government solved is completely ridiculous. Now, the fact is that the ACLU has done what it can to try to provide information to reunite parents and children, but this is a problem that the government solved, and that government, by God, ought to fix it.
So you would not take his offer of a public-private partnership with the administration?
Correct. There's just no forming a partnership with some of these folks.
2 general advice for those of us.
Wow, you really want advice from me?
Okay,
I can't believe it.
One piece of advice. I mean, obviously, no one is looking to, become an esteemed director of a national organization or anything like that. So we won't take your advice. Don't worry. That's a relief. In terms of advice, I don't know. I don't know why anybody ought to be taking advice from me. I do think that to use your legal training and very soon your law degree to make a difference in people's lives is something that makes all of the work and the preparation and everything all worthwhile. And it does, and it isn't always much. It isn't always a big deal. Sometimes it's helping somebody get a $150 security deposit back. Sometimes it's helping somebody stay in their apartment for an extra week or 10 days until they can find someplace to live. Sometimes it's getting a benefit for a disabled child or a disabled spouse that may or may not seem like a lot of money to you, but can really make a difference in people's lives. And it is a privilege, and that word gets thrown around a lot, but it's a privilege to be able to do that kind of work, because I think that you're not just doing it for somebody else, you're actually getting repaid in kind, and more so in the effect that it has on you. David Cole, who is the legal director for the American Civil Liberties Union, says that the relationship between optimism and activism is often misunderstood. He says it is not true that optimistic people become activists. What is true is that activists, people who go out and do things and make a difference in people's lives, by reason of their activism, therefore become optimistic as a result. And when he said that, I said to myself, yeah, that sounds right to me.
Thank you for listening to the Cold Call Lawcast. Follow us on social media at Cold Call Lawcast. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Ask us any question you'd like, and we'll answer it on our next episode. We'll see you next time.